So my hair is officially the longest that it's ever been, so I think the time's right.
Revenge of the Remakes.
Samson and Samson and Delilah. So for this installment of Revenge of the Remakes, I'm going to be taking a look at Cecil B. DeMille's original 1949 adaptation of Samson and Delilah and compare it with the more recent 2018 PureFlix version. Because I love the story of Samson and Delilah, and it's one of those stories that doesn't often get talked about even among Christians. And I think a lot of that's because he's such a flawed and troubled individual, and he made a lot of mistakes throughout his life, so much so that his death actually did more to help the Hebrews than his life did. But even though Jeff Foxworthy's American Bible Challenge considers him a villain, I don't. I see him more as an anti-hero, or even just a very flawed and confused hero. That's because he does ultimately do the right thing in the end by sacrificing himself for the greater good, and killing a lot of Philistines in the process. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So Samson was born into the tribe of Dan while they were under the rule of the Philistines. And when he was born, he was dedicated to God to be Israel's next military leader or judge, because at that point they didn't really have a king because they had just left Pharaoh in Egypt and they didn't really want to go back into that centralized power. But they still needed someone to lead the people. So they had judges. And as part of his dedication, he had to keep 3 vows. Not to drink any alcohol, not to touch anything unclean like a dead body, and most importantly, to not cut his hair. And this is about where both versions pick up. Samson is already a grown adult. They both, for some reason, skip over the miraculous circumstances of his conception, which involves an angel disappearing in a burst of fire, and that's where the 3 vows come from. Look it up for yourself. It's such a missed opportunity for some really cool visuals. But regardless, Samson's an adult now, and in the 1949 version, he's already broken 2 of the 3 vows, so he's really holding on to that last one. And he's played by Victor Mature, who is not a bad choice to play Samson. He's big and strong and has a deep voice, very masculine, very commanding, but also a little playful. A pretty solid Samson. The only issue I have with him is, one, his hair doesn't look nearly long enough, and also, he doesn't have a beard, which I find odd because if he can't cut his hair, I feel like that includes facial hair and body hair and just all the hair. Which leaves only 2 options. One, Samson just couldn't grow any facial hair. He's going to be babyface for the rest of his life. Which is a lie, considering that he's a Danite Hebrew and everybody in his family has a beard. Or the movie just cheated because it's 1949 and slapping a beard onto a movie star for the whole movie was kind of unheard of. But in the remake, we have Taylor James playing Samson, and he is also not a bad Samson. He is also big and strong and masculine, and he's more toned than Victor Mature was. He's got more of that Marvel superhero physique than Victor Mature's dad bod. And his hair is a pretty good length, but again, no beard. Where's the facial hair on this guy? In both versions, guys, why do they have to constantly shave Samson's face? I mean, that'd be like if you'd made an Exodus movie and didn't give Moses his ginormous Moses beard. Oh wait, they kind of did that, didn't they? But in that movie's defense, at least he had some facial hair. He wasn't just completely shaven like these 2 guys. And again, I can kind of forgive the original a little bit for being a product of its time, but Samson was made in 2018. And not only that, it was made by PureFlix, a Christian-run, operated production company that prides itself on being biblically accurate, and we have a hairless Samson. Get it together, guys. But facial hair aside, I do like both these actors' interpretations of Samson. Taylor James plays up the more youthful, shirking responsibility, frat boy partying type of Samson that is consistent with the scriptures. But while Victor Mature also has that rebellious energy in him, there is a certain amount of dignity that he brings to Samson, where you can see that even though he's not the most responsible and does make a lot of boneheaded mistakes, you can still see why God chose him in just the way that he carries himself. He does command respect, even when he does things that aren't very respectable. And that's really hard to pull off. So looking at these 2 Samsons, I do have to say Victor Mature does a better job, just because he brings more to the role, and he is admittedly a better actor. But moving on, Samson goes to Timnah and falls in love with a Philistine woman who is not named in the Bible. In the 1949 version, she's played by Angela Lansbury, Mrs. Potts, and she goes by the name of Semidar. In the 2018 version, she's played by Frances Sholto Douglas, and goes by the name of Taryn. And I'm not really sure how to judge this one because both characters aren't all that complex and they die pretty early on. But I guess in this case I'll have to go with the 2018 one because even though she's not nearly as big a name as Angela Lansbury is. This movie spends a good amount of time establishing this relationship between her and Samson, even though it's not destined to last long. But while I'm at, let's talk about that death, because there are some things to note. Now, for those of you who might not know, in the biblical accounts, Samson and this woman do get married, and at their wedding feast, Samson gives a riddle to his Philistine companions, a riddle that they clearly don't know the answer of, but they go to his wife and say, hey, can you get the secret out of him and give it to us so that we can win, because there's this tension between the Philistines and the Hebrews, and she doesn't want to start a war, so she of course complies and gets the answer from Samson through tears. And she tells the Philistines the answer, so they win the bet, and now Samson has to go and get 30 tunics for them. But while he's out, the marriage ceremony has to continue with someone, and since Samson said some unkindly words to his future bride, her father gives her to one of the companions instead, and when he comes back, he's all upset. A fight breaks out, he burns down their harvest and vineyard, and then the Philistines kill the lady's father and the lady, and everything's on fire, and everyone's dying and fighting, and it's this entirely brutal event. And as a casualty of that, Samson's Philistine bride dies in the fire. And that hits him pretty hard. And in both versions, it starts out pretty exact. You get the wedding feast, you get his companions, you get the riddle. Everything seems to be going on track, that is, until the betrayal happens. And this is where the 1949 version takes a turn, makes a choice that doesn't exactly follow scripture. He fights them right when he comes back, and the house does end up burning. And then he goes out into the wheat fields and the harvest of the vineyards and burns all that down. But it's not the fire that kills Samedar in this version. It's a Philistine spear that goes through her during the fighting. So I'm not exactly sure why they made that change, but it is there. And another important difference is the means by which Samson sets the fire in the first place. In the Bible, as well as the 2018 version, he ties flaming sticks to the tails of foxes and lets them go loose in the fields, kind of burning it very wildly. But in the 49 version, you don't see any foxes at all. You just see him burning the fields himself directly. Now let's talk about the Philistines themselves. Interestingly enough, in both versions, you have a really famous actor playing the king, and then a prince played by a lesser-known actor that more directly deals with Samson. And this is interesting because in the biblical account, they don't really mention the Philistine leadership at all. There's no names given to any of the rulers. You don't even really see Samson interact with any of them. But you have to have some kind of leadership because it is a kingdom. Someone has to be in charge. In the 49 version, you have the Saran played by George Sanders, who you may recognize as the voice of Shere Khan from The Jungle Book, but who I always recognize as the best live-action Mr. Freeze that we've ever had from the Adam West 60s TV series. But he plays a really good king here too. He's very smart, very calculating, very cunning, and surprisingly savage. And you can see how he's amassed and kept this empire from falling apart. He is by all means a qualified ruler, even if he is a bit on the tyrannical side. That is compared to the 2018 version where you had the ruler played by Billy Zane of all people. Yes, that Billy Zane. Not really the same calm, cool, and collected Saran that we have in George Sanders. No, this king it's Billy Zane as a tyrant. He's a bit more over the top and emotional and bombastic, but he's also more savage, which I do appreciate, because even though the practices of the Philistines aren't described in detail in the account of Samson, but elsewhere in the Bible and even elsewhere in the book of Judges, you do see more of what the Philistines were like, and they had some pretty barbaric practices. But as much fun as it is seeing Billy Zane up on that throne barking orders, I do have to give it to George Sanders, just because he's more collected, he's more in control, and that's scarier for me. Because it makes you feel like Samson's not just fighting the rulership, but also the entire armies that he commands. And for me, that just makes him more intimidating and a more effective villain. And at risk of repeating myself, the same can be said for the princes. They both emulate the same qualities of their king and do it about as effectively. But wasn't there supposed to be a Delilah in this movie? Yes, and strangely enough, in the biblical account, Delilah doesn't come into the story until almost the end. Samson has all these adventures before he even meets Delilah. So in order to give Delilah a bit more of a presence in that first half, both versions do what the Bible doesn't and gives her a backstory. Nobody really knows where Delilah came from. All we know is that she is a Philistine and that she does have connections somehow with the higher-ups in the leadership. And since she is the thing that brings Samson to his lowest low, she really should have more of a presence in the story. So in the 2018 version, she's betrothed to the prince, and she kind of lives in the palace. And she sees how infuriated the prince is over this, so she comes up with a scheme to get Samson basically to fall in love with her and reveal his secret so that they can take advantage of it, strip him of his power, and squash the rebellion that is growing within the Hebrew tribes. So they do exactly that. I guess this is a more biblical interpretation because she isn't mentioned, so she wouldn't really have much of a purpose. And even though she's played well by Caitlin Leahy, she doesn't really do anything in the first half of the movie, and every time you see her, she's just kind of lurking around or snooping or causing a little bit of trouble here and there to really no great effect to the plot. And she has zero interactions with Samson himself until that second half. But now compare that to the 1949 version where she's played by the incredibly talented Hedy Lamarr. And if you don't know who Hedy Lamarr is, look her up. She was not only one of the best actresses of that era, but she did so much more outside of acting, outside of film, that I don't really have the time to go into right now. But look her up, it's fascinating. And it's here where Delilah is depicted as the younger sister of Semidar, who was Samson's first wife. And this is pretty clever because even though the Bible doesn't outright say that Delilah was her younger sister, we do know that she did have a younger sister that her father offered to Samson after Semidar was given away to the other man. And we have no idea who this younger sister is. She doesn't factor into the story at all. So it's not the biggest stretch to assume that maybe Delilah was that younger sister. And assuming that doesn't directly contradict or even change anything else in the Bible, all it does is offer Samson and Delilah more of an opportunity to spend some time together, have some chemistry before the romance blooms later in the movie. So looking at these two Delilahs, there really is no contest. I have to give it to Hedy Lamarr. She's just a better actress. She brings more to the role. She's much more charismatic. And even though the character of Delilah in the remake is a much more literal interpretation of the Bible, I feel like that the changes that were made in the 1949 version helped to elevate the story and make it go smoother than to take away from the biblical account. But you cannot have a good Samson movie without having some really awesome action sequences, and both of these movies deliver on that. And the first major confrontation that Samson has in both versions is when he fights the lion. Now the circumstances surrounding this lion fight are very different from version to version, and both are surprisingly different from the biblical account. In the 49 version, Semidar and the prince and the troops are off on a lion hunt, and Samson and Delilah go to find them, and they come across a lion first, and Samson has to defend Delilah from this lion, and they fight, and it's a really intense battle, especially when you consider that it's a real lion in 1949, and it looks incredibly dangerous. Even though I'm sure that the lion was very well trained, and they had stuntmen that knew what they were doing and everything, but it's still a lion. You never know what's going to happen, and some of the shots that they got looked very risky. But I guess that's par for the course when you've got Cecil B. DeMille directing, and he just lives and breathes risky. But I gotta say, I was kind of disappointed in the 2018 version, because even though they did get a real lion, they did not make it CGI, which I thought they might, but considering their very tight budget, that was probably out of the question. So they did get a real lion, but the fight was over like that. It only lasts a couple seconds. A lion pounces on him, he snaps its neck, and it's dead. There's no real fight, there's no blood, there's no tearing. The Bible says that Samson tore the lion apart with his bare hands, and neither movie really depicts that to my satisfaction, but the fight in the 49 version definitely comes closer. But the next big action scene is the one that I have to give to the remake, and it's when Samson fights 1,000 soldiers with the jawbone of a donkey. Both versions do this scene justice, and to be fair, there are some pretty gnarly makeup effect shots of the cracked skulls of the dead Philistines in Cecil B. DeMille's version. But in the remake, this sequence is straight out of 300. There's slow-mo, there's bodies upon bodies of Philistines falling. He works them into this narrow passage where their numbers mean nothing, just like Leonidas, and he's throwing them off of cliffs. He's clubbing them in the head. He's doing all sorts of really awesome choreography, and you get a sense of the devastation that's taking place here. And this scene is not just an awesome scene of Samson fighting a bunch of people. This is the highlight of the movie for me. And honestly, if it wasn't for this scene in particular, and a couple other violent scenes that kind of foreshadowed this, I wouldn't have thought twice about Samson. I would have just saw it as another PureFlix film with a shoestring budget that just couldn't live up to the epicness and scale of its source material. But I have to say that when Samson fights in this version, he really fights, and you feel it, and it's epic, and the filmmaking is really good. The only downside is that for the rest of the movie, it just never quite reaches that level. But nowhere is that more evident than in the climax, where Samson has been betrayed, he got his hair cut, he's blind, and he's standing between the two pillars, and he pushes it and knocks down the idol and the temple and everything, and all the Philistines die, and he dies with them. And this basically plays out the same in both versions, but it's in the Cecil B. DeMille one where the budget really shows. When that temple comes crashing down, it comes crashing down. It's an entirely practical setup that for sure combines miniatures, but also had a lot of practical environments when the temple was coming down. And you can tell that this is the director of Ten Commandments and King of Kings, because this is the epicness that he's known for. And you feel it when stones are coming down, landing and crushing bodies and killing them, and people are trapped under them. And while the remake does this too, the set is noticeably smaller. It doesn't feel grand or epic like this hub of Philistine life is coming to the ground. It just feels like there's a few dozen people crammed into this smaller courtyard, and they're all getting crushed by rocks and debris and stuff. And when it cuts to the establishing shot of the temple itself crumbling in on itself, it's some noticeable CGI. And that's really where the remake suffers. Because it was on such a tight budget, it can't afford to have the same production design or grand scale that Cecil B. DeMille pulled off. And before I wrap up, there is one more thing in both versions that kind of bothers me, and it's really a symptom of biblical movies as a whole. And it's that biblical movies tend to fall into one of two categories, the ones that are directed by Christians and the ones that are directed by atheists. And the problem with the ones directed by atheists should be pretty obvious. It's that they don't really understand the scriptures and they change a lot of details. And at best, it just weakens the narrative, and at worst, it just completely misses the point. But the Christian movies have an equally as dangerous flaw, and both Samson movies do this, although the remake does it to a greater degree. And it's that I feel like a lot of Christian directors and writers feel like they need to clean up the Bible. If you were to pick a random book in the Bible and try to adapt that as accurately as possible, it would be a rated R movie, because the Bible doesn't pull its punches. Especially when you look at the Old Testament, because it's just a list of flawed individuals that made some pretty major mistakes in their life that God was still able to use to achieve greatness and further his people. And I feel like the fear of a lot of Christians is that they can't depict the flaws or even talk about the flaws of these people because they're such holy people. Even though if you're a Christian, you know that the only holy person was Jesus and everybody else sins. And as a Christian myself, if these biblical movies really want to attract audiences, they need to look honestly at the people that they're representing. Especially when you look at Samson, who has made so many very public mistakes. And when I see the PureFlix version try to clean him up and make him more holy than he actually was, it really kind of rubs me the wrong way, because that's not who Samson was. And nobody can relate to a character if you make them too perfect. So that's pretty much how I feel about Samson and Samson and Delilah. They're both decent representations of the biblical story. Samson does follow it a bit closer in some areas and does show a bit more of some of the lesser known aspects of Samson's life. But the Cecil B. DeMille version, even though it does tweak some things here and there, still gives us a more relatable Samson, a better villain, a more epic story, and just a grander scale. So objectively, this one I think does tell the story better, but if there was ever a scene to save a movie, that scene where Samson fights 1,000 Philistines might be it, because it's just so good, and I might recommend Samson just for that scene alone. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Samson and Samson and Delilah? Have you seen these movies? Samson was not very popular when it came out, and Samson and Delilah was made in the 40s, so have you seen them both? Have you seen one, not the other? Let me know in the comments. And as always, if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.